Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog for Mint Press. Today, we are again going against the grain with more investigative and searing journalism that the world needs in the public interest. For that reason, I hope that you can support us by liking and sharing this video and contributing to Patreon. Today, we are joined by the legendary Professor David Miller. He is in the midst of a major crisis whereby we have seen actors connected to the Israeli state pushing him out of his position at Bristol University. David, how are you?
I'm well, Karim. I hope you're well too.
It's really good to be joined by you. Thank you for giving us this time right now. To start with, it would be great if you could give the viewers an idea of who you are and what you do pre all of this.
So my name is David Miller. I call myself an investigative researcher, which means that I do research on how the world operates from the perspective that the processes which run the world are not necessarily easily visible to the naked eye, which means that you have to investigate how organizations operate, how they relate to each other, and the forces standing behind organizations. It's not always easy to find those things out. There are processes in the world which mitigate against that, such as secrecy and power. The aim of investigative research is to get underneath the front of which is much of politics, to the workings underneath of how our society is turned into the kind of thing it is, by which I mean, of course, the kinds of inequalities that we see in contemporary society, and also the set of relationships there is between states, by which I mean the prosecution of war and human rights abuses and the like. So I've done that kind of research since I started out, when I first darkened the door of the Glasgow University Media Group at Glasgow University just after the end of the miners' strike. I popped my head around the door and said, "Hello, I'm David, can I help?" And when they had worked out that I wasn't a special branch agent, they said, "Yes, you can." And they brought me in, and I started to do research on television news and television news bias with the media group. Eventually getting a research job there, working on on issues like the attacks that there were on the media group at the time, on HIV and AIDS, on health and science, and their role in the media, and also started to do a PhD in the late 80s on the conflict in the north of Ireland. And that's a conflict which is peculiarly relevant to the topics we might go on to talk about later for reasons I'll explain. So that's in the work on Northern Ireland and in the work I did on HIV and AIDS and on health and science. I became very, very interested, not just in the question of media bias and the way in which mainstream media are consistently biased towards power holders in our society, but also became interested in how that was accomplished, not just by looking at the way in which journalists operated, but looking at the way in which information was supplied to newsrooms every day, and the way in which official sources, meaning the government and to some extent corporations, were always able to dominate the news, always able to set the frame of reference, and always able to skew the news towards the interests of the powerful. And that's a well-known and established fact in all media sociology, and there's no point in us even discussing the merits of it because it's simply true. But I became interested in the way in which information control and information supply was able to manipulate and manage the news, and that directed my attention to the organizations and institutions which were producing information to be supplied to newsrooms, by which, of course, we mean the information and communication apparatus of the state and of corporations, usually referred to as public relations or communications, and previously, of course, referred to back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s as propaganda. Now, propaganda is a good term for those kinds of activities because it says something about the concrete effects that propaganda has on the society. It suggests, it comes from the word, doesn't it, for to propagate, to make new growth in the society. And that's better, I think, than information supply, which sounds much more passive, and better than public relations, the idea that propaganda is only about negotiating between different people's interests. Well, no, it's not. Propaganda is always about the pursuit of interest and the imposition of interest, the attempted imposition of interest. So I became very interested in propaganda. In the question of HIV and AIDS, looked at the way in which the Department of Health and the moral conservative movement were operating to try and pursue particular policy agendas. And in relation to the conflict in the north of Ireland, I did a lot of work in Belfast and Derry and other parts of the north, and indeed in London, to interviewing people who were involved in this. So from the political movements involved in the conflict there, both on the Republican and the Loyalist or Unionist side, but also, and most importantly, at the official sources of information, by which, of course, we mean the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office, the Northern Ireland Office, the Army, and the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the overwhelmingly Protestant police force that then existed in the north of Ireland. Now, I don't know if people will have seen, but there's a film just out called The Man Who Knew Too Much, about Colin Wallace, who was employed, and of course I interviewed Colin for my research back in the day, who was employed by the Ministry of Defence, but was also secretly employed by the intelligence agencies. And he had a covert job description. And his role, to summarise a whole load of information which you would get from that film, his role was to plant false information in the press, which would pursue the interests of the intelligence services, not always the same as the interests of the government of the day, but certainly the interests of the intelligence services. And that meant publishing and planting false information, misinformation and disinformation. It was part of what was called then psychological operations, a term which the army now tries to pretend is not part of its raison d'etre, but of course remains part of its rationale and its reasoning and part of its operations, as indicated in the activities of the 77th Brigade, which we might come back to later on. So Colin was involved in propaganda. I became very interested in propaganda and the way in which it could help to skew the media and help to pursue a particular interest in the conflict. And so I came to see propaganda and information control as being really central to not just the manipulation of the media, but to the kind of harnessing of society in a particular direction. And so from then on, I became a sort of researcher in propaganda, in public relations. I did a large project on corporate public relations, looking at the ways in which corporations used propaganda, the same thing, to pursue their interests, which took me into the whole area of corporate spin, of deception, and the like. And then also at one remove from the question of manipulating the media into the question of corporate influence on government, which takes one, of course, straight to the question of lobbying, corporate lobbying, the question of transparency in lobbying, the extent to which we know which are the corporations which are pulling the strings behind particular policy initiatives. And I guess everyone is now familiar with that kind of idea. Back in the day when I started doing this work, what would it be, the early 90s, it wasn't so clear, but everyone now knows that there are links between corporations, money, lobbying, government ministers, and policy outcomes. It couldn't be more visible in the current Conservative government, but this has been the case for some considerable period of time now, going back at least to the 1980s, when the lobbying industry was unleashed by the Thatcher administrations from 79 to 1990. So I became interested in all of that, the question not just of information control and propaganda and influence of the media, but the influence of propaganda and lobbying on policy outcomes and then on outcomes in society. So that's kind of what got me into this. And I started by saying that I was an investigative researcher. You know, when you start to do work in this area, you very quickly come across the fact that powerful interests do not want you to know what they're doing. And so you can't rock up and say, hello, Mr. Powerful Person, can you tell me all the terrible things that you're doing. You have to go and interview them, certainly, but you have to find other ways of undermining and getting past the secrecy and the front that they put up. And of course, there are ways of doing that, and the internet has made that much more easy. The way in which you can gather data now with social media and with the internet has made it easier to find things out about powerful organizations. And of course, the fact of digital information has made it easier for whistleblowers to get huge tranches of information out into the public domain, as we see with WikiLeaks and all the various other known leaks of digital information. We see it today in the Pandora Papers, for example. So that's me. I mean, I investigate stuff. I investigate the powerful, and I want to understand how our society is in such a state, why it is so divided and so unequal, why our society allows or condones or facilitates the waging of aggressive war on peoples overseas. And of course, the point of that is to not just understand it, but to change it.
And also, I think it would be great if you give us a rundown of what exactly Powerbase is and how you were and are involved in it. It's a great resource for me and many others that I know.
So, a key moment in this, the whole trajectory. I mean, I started off doing work on Northern Ireland, but then I then did a lot of work on health and science and those kinds of issues. But a key moment which brought me back to the question of conflict was 9/11. And very shortly after 9/11, I did a piece in The Guardian about the manipulation of opinion polls on Afghanistan. And I started to do a lot of work on that kind of the build to war in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. And it became apparent that as a result of that work and as a result of work on lobbying in Scotland, in the new Scottish, around the new Scottish Parliament, it became apparent that these issues weren't going away. That the issue of lobbying, of transparency around lobbying, and the issue of state lying and propaganda, as in the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, weren't going away, and it wasn't really sufficient to do something about that for academics just to publish academic work. There had to be some kind of campaigning body which could do investigative journalism and campaign for more transparency. So we decided, two of us, two academics and two journalists, to set up public interest investigations, which set up the website Spinwatch. And we did a lot of research and published reports. And then we came across the experience of Wikipedia, and then in the States, an organization called Disinfopedia, which now is called SourceWatch, run by our colleagues in the Center for Media and Democracy, who did a lot of research on public relations and spin. And so we decided that we probably should start up a wiki-based database on spin, lobbying, propaganda, and the manipulation of public debate. And so we set that up. We called it Spin Profiles at the beginning, and then later we changed its name to Powerbase. And it has, 20,000, 25,000 pages on it of profiles of individuals and organizations which are engaged in lobbying, corporate spin, propaganda, manipulation of public debate, etc. And so the aim was that there should be a public repository of carefully sourced information and evidenced information about organizations which were engaged in the power structure in some way in pursuing the interests of the powerful over the interests of the interests more generally of the public. And so that's been going. Powerbase has been going now for 15 years maybe, and it continues to monitor abuse and lobbying and to try and put that stuff in the public domain. So it's intended to be a public resource. And what the beauty of it is that when we have a reasonable page on an individual or an organization, quite often, if someone Googles their name, one of our pages will come up in the first page of Google Hits, and people will be able to see what should we say? Let's not say alternative facts, but people can see the kind of the evidence base underlying the activities of this organization, which would be quite different usually to their own claims about themselves.
Yeah, without the PR, without the sort of careful management of PR, which is afforded today by the mainstream media. So then, from this understanding of the way power functions within society, how do you define, and the book that you were involved in, What is Islamophobia? Social Movements from Above, is really essential reading for all. How would you define Islamophobia?
So, one of the things that we've done all the way through this is to say that our system does not operate by just invisible, ineluctable economic or political laws. That our system has to be put in place and reproduced every day by the active role of individuals and organizations. And that means, corporations, states, and communication and media organizations are all day in, day out involved in producing and reproducing the inequalities which we see around us every day. So our view has always been that it's important not to overemphasize agency in the creation of inequality, but that we have to give agency its place as creating structures and recreating structures and changing structures. So that's why we are keen on talking about structures, but we're also keen on talking about agency. And I think that's a key thing some people don't understand. They think that we commit the voluntaristic error or something, or that we're involved in conspiracy or something. Now, of course, people engaged in trying to manage the political agenda, which is everyone involved in politics, are engaged in conspiracies. They do conspire to pursue their own interests, sometimes secretly, sometimes not secretly, and that is just simply called the pursuit of interest. It's what politics is, and so we've been interested in that, but we're interested in that in the context of the creation of structures. So it's not that conspiracies rule, or that there's some secret conspiracy which runs the world, which is obviously preposterous, but there are political agendas which are put forward by organizations, and they fight it out over the rewards that they can or can't get. So that's what we've been interested in. And so when it comes to racism is not something in line with that perspective. Racism is not something which is just there in the structure of society, which we can't do anything about, and which hasn't been put in place by certain organizations. It's something which is actively put in place by institutions and organizations. And if that's the case, then we can say who they are. We should be able to point to them and evidence who they are. It's put in place in an active process. And the easy way to demonstrate that is to say, well, are all forms of racism always equally present in the society? And of course, they're not. The massive increase in Islamophobia after 9/11 is not an accident. It didn't just happen because it was the Muslims' turn. It's been the Jews' turn before, and now it's the Muslims' turn. It happened because of the pursuit of interests. Racism is about the pursuit of interests. It's not some kind of expression of a latent hostility between races in the world. It's not some kind of always present function of human society. Racism is a doctrine which is put in place, which concretely disadvantages particular groups who are, in the lingo, racialized, who are determined to be like a race. And of course, the predominant one in the contemporary period is Muslims that are racialized in that kind of way. So we don't see racism as being something which is just about hatred or hate crimes or attacks on the street, important though they are. Racism is something which is structural in the society, but it changes in the society. The groups who are the recipients, who are the targets of racism, change in society, and that relates not to some generalized hatred of people of color by white people, but to the interests of the powerful. I think that's true of racism in general. But let's talk specifically about Islamophobia. When you talk about a form of racism which is important in the society, then you have to look at what are the interests which drive that form of racism, and therefore also who are the institutions and individuals who are carrying those interests, who pursue those interests. It's their interests. It's not the generalized interest of the system. It's their interests, as well as more general, in a more general sense. And in the case of Islamophobia, what we find, everyone knows this, don't they, that Islamophobia increases as a result of the war on terror. And why does it increase as a result of the war on terror? Because powerful organizations, in particular Western states and their counterterrorism apparatus, the intelligence services, the military, the defense establishment, decide that Muslims have to be disadvantaged and targeted because that's the way to legitimate the policy options that they want to impose. In the post 9/11 period, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, and then laterally, of course, actions against Libya and indeed Syria and many other actions which people are aware of. So Islamophobia comes from the interests of what should we call it, the complex, isn't it? I mean, the military-industrial complex, yes, but the complex of actors and individuals who want to single out Muslims. And in the case of the UK, what we say is that there are 5 pillars of Islamophobia, that the main backbone of Islamophobia is the state counterterrorism apparatus. That's, in this country, the defence establishment, the Foreign Office, the Home Office, MI5 and MI6, GCHQ, and indeed the whole panoply of other public sector organisations which pursue counterterrorism initiatives under the Counterterrorism and Security Act, where public servants in universities and podiatrists and nurseries and dentists, etc., have to be part of the counterterrorism apparatus. That's the main thing which day in, day out causes disadvantages for Muslims in our society. Not the EDL on the street, not attacks on Muslims and women having the hijab ripped off, awful how those things are. The way in which men of Pakistani origin, when that's the way the stats are compiled, are 140 times or so more likely to be stopped and searched under the Prevention of Terrorism Act that on the way in and out of the country than are people of white ethnicity. So we see that's the main backbone of Islamophobia is the state, and big surprise. So that's the first thing, the first pillar we would say of Islamophobia. But we go on to say that there are also 4 social movements, and these are social movements which we've categorized in a rather general way, but we can specify them. 4 social movements which help to push the society towards the targeting of Muslims and to disadvantage Muslims further, and to push the state further in its Islamophobia. And we identify these social movements as being, first of all, the neoconservative movement, a movement which people often think is just based in the US, but of course has very strong representation in this country and in many other countries too, through think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society, the most obvious one, and to some extent the Policy Exchange and many other institutions and organizations. So the neoconservative movement, important there. Secondly, the counter-jihad movement and the far right. People think of the far right, we used to think of the far right as being the National Front of the British National Party, but of course the more recent kids on the block here are people who style themselves the counter-jihad movement, i.e. the anti-Muslim movement effectively. The EDL, Pegida, a whole series of other organizations across Europe. So far, so uncontroversial, probably. And then the other 2 movements we identify are a sort of ragbag of groups on the left, some feminist organizations, pro-war left, some elements of the secular movement, indeed some elements of the LGBTQI movement as well, as being engaged in anti-Islamic or anti-Muslim activities. I could talk more about that if you would wish. And then the fourth of these 4 social movements we say is parts of the Zionist movement, and that's of course the thing which has caused debate, controversy, and alarm on some sections of the left, and indeed, of course, amongst the Zionists themselves. And what we say about that is that parts of the Zionist movement when we wrote the book, we had done much less research on this than we now have, but I'll come back to that. When we wrote the book, we said parts of the Zionist movement because what we were talking about specifically was the involvement of pro-Israel groups, and especially large philanthropic and foundation groups in funding activities which were Islamophobic. And by which we meant, yes, the far right, because there are pro-Israel groups that fund the far right, and pro-Israel groups in the US, for example, have funded Tommy Robinson, Stephen Yaxley Lennon's legal fees, etc., but also the funding of core Islamophobic groupings in both the States and in this country. And so that's a fact. We have the data, we have the receipts, we have the annual reports and accounts, the Charity Commission or the Internal Revenue Service in the US, which show that there is that connection. And on top of that, the other evidence we have is that many of those organizations are also directly supporting settlement activity beyond the Green Line in Palestine. This is not controversial in the sense that it's obviously and trivially true. No one has ever disputed any of the facts that we have dug up on this matter, and that's because they can't, because it's there in black and white in the figures. So we say that these Zionist organizations, pro-Israel organizations, are funding, yes, the far right, also the neoconservative movement, and to some extent some elements of left Islamophobia as well. And that's where we were at the stage of publishing the book, and then when I subsequently did my lecture on Islamophobia for students in 2019 at the University of Bristol.
And it's important to note that the one side of the sort of symbiotic relationship is a lot of the mainstream media. So, for example, you look at someone like Rupert Murdoch. He's on the board of Genie Energy, which is an oil and gas company, alongside James Woolsey, former head of the CIA, who is one of the founding signatories of the Henry Jackson Society, which of course shares funders with the Friends of the IDF and illegal settlements in the West Bank. That company, Genie Energy, has also got contracts from the Israeli government to develop oil and gas in the Israeli-occupied part of Syria, the Golan Heights. We also know that Robert Shillman, who was on the board for the Friends of the IDF, who also funds the Friends of the IDF, Christians United for Israel, the JNF, which builds illegal settlements, was a direct funder of Tommy Robinson, according to his former employee, Lucy Brown, to the tune of £10,000 per month as a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Center. We also know the Middle East Forum funded Tommy Robinson, his legal fees. The director of the Middle East Forum is Greg Roman, a former employee of the Israeli Ministry of Defense and the Israeli Foreign Ministry. As you went into, there's other connections with major figures on the Islamophobic sort of celebrity scene in Britain. But Sarah Marusik, in the book, What is Islamophobia, found that 75% of the organizations which fund the Islamophobia industry, so these kind of organizations like Middle East Forum and the Henry Jackson Society, also fund the building of illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which are in violation of UN Resolution 2334. You also see the relationship between organizations that fund ELAD, the settler organization. I mean, it's worth remembering also about Rupert Murdoch that News Corps Foundation was one of the funders of the Jerusalem Foundation, which builds settlements in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. And so what you have is this relationship whereby the Center for Security Policy in the United States, which is given the credit by the White House for the intellectual foundation for the Muslim ban, it's not only funded by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, but is also funded by the Claremont Family Foundation, which in turn also funded Tommy Robinson through the Middle East Forum and ELAD. So you have all of these kind of interlocking situations with the Zionist movement, even from Sheldon Adelson, biggest funder of settlements in the West Bank, also funding Islamophobic organizations, the Marcus Foundation, the Paul E. Singer Foundation, again, funding the Friends of the IDF, and also funding Islamophobic organizations as well. So as you say, this is something that is clearly documented, which if people look at the brilliant work that you and others have done on this, then it's something that they really can't argue with. These are organizations that define themselves as Zionist organizations that are funding both settlements and funding these organizations, which society clearly understands to be Islamophobic organizations. Where did the first complaint about your work come from?
So I started at the University of Bristol in September 2018. And 5 months later, I was doing a lecture on Islamophobia, where I was discussing, in part, the parts of the Zionist movement involved in funding Islamophobia. And a month or so later, the Community Security Trust complained to the university that my lecture had involved anti-Semitic tropes, or potentially involved anti-Semitic tropes, and that it was intimidating for Jewish students. Now, the Community Security Trust and I have a long history going back many years before that. The Community Security Trust is an organization which styles itself as the defender of the Jewish people and a campaigner against anti-Semitism, as not a pro-Israel organization. But in reality, of course, it's unable to, or unwilling to, distinguish between Jewish people and Zionism, and is actually an active defender of the Israeli state. My first encounter with the CST came again in the case of the Immigration Appeal Tribunal against Sheikh Salah, who was a Palestinian leader who had come to the UK, and the CST had been involved with the Home Office in deciding that he shouldn't be allowed into the country, but he came into the country because they didn't know when he was coming, and they then arrested him, and they took a case against him. But the case was based largely on information supplied to the Home Office by the CST, and we were able to look at that evidence and show that it had been effectively doctored at some point in the process. They'd inserted the word Jewish in one of his poems, which wasn't there, and there were many other distortions and misrepresentations amongst their evidence. And I gave evidence as an expert for the defense, for Salah's defense, and that was in part the reason that the case against him was lost by the government, and indeed there were sharp words for the CST's activities in the judgment.
I mean,
so the CST I had previous, and they put this complaint in April 2018, in April 2019, and it was then rejected by the university because the CST is not a student and doesn't have a locus in making a complaint according to the university's policies, which is quite the appropriate response. The CST then, of course, approached the Union of Jewish Students in London and prevailed upon them to write a letter of complaint, and the UJS then recruited the president of the Bristol Jewish Society, which is part of the UJS, to sign that complaint. And of course, that complaint was accepted because she was, that is the president of the Bristol JSOC, was a student at the university at the time, although she had never been my student, never attended any of my lectures, etc. And that complaint was put into the university in 2019 and was then rejected by the university. It was rejected on the grounds that it was it didn't make its case, and that the comments that they were complaining about that I had made were not anti-Semitic, were in fact just critical of Israel. And I should point out that that complaint included 5 examples of things I was alleged to have said or had written stretching back to 2013. So they tried to cobble together a effectively ridiculous list of things that I had said, but they misquoted me, and they misinterpreted what I'd said and pretended that was evidence of anti-Semitism when it patently wasn't. And so that's when we got to the end of the first process. But they then appealed, and there was a further process. And I can't really talk much about that process, except to say that I was entirely exonerated in that process of anything remotely like anti-Semitism. Now, that's something which people I don't really know and haven't been told, but that was a process which ended by the beginning of this year, and was entirely separate to the next investigation which I was made to undergo, which started in March this year. So there's been two separate investigations, and people I think are unaware of that so far.
I think it's also important for people to understand that, according to Anthony Lehrman, who's the founder of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, the Community Security Trust volunteers have been trained by Israel's external intelligence service. It's also known that the Community Security Trust has been found to be given lists of anti-Zionist Jews to the Home Office, designating them as extreme groups and encouraging the Home Office to take harsh measures towards them. In what other ways can we say that the Community Security Trust is clearly linked to the Israeli state?
Well, I mean, the founder of the CST, Gerald Ronson, the convicted fraudster, is one of Netanyahu's millionaires, as was revealed in a leaked document in the Israeli press some years ago. Netanyahu came to visit him when he was in prison. I think I'm not sure if it was on parole, but when he was in prison, he was Netanyahu. I mean, they're very close to Netanyahu. And of course, many of the activities they've been involved in have been activities which are pro-Israel activities. They were involved in the Fair Play campaign group, the group set up to counteract BDS. That's not the activity of an organization which simply is about defending Jews from contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism. It's well known that the CST is a pro-Israel group, and it's well known it finds it very difficult to distinguish between anti-Israel and anti-Semitic commentary. In fact, it deliberately blurs the two together. So when it's talking about what it calls left-wing or Muslim anti-Semitism, it will quite often put that on the same page as photographs of actual and traditional anti-Semitism from the right. And that's dishonest, and that's the way they operate. They want to be able to say that there's such a thing as left-wing anti-Semitism, that there's such a thing as, especially as Muslim anti-Semitism, and that in itself raises questions about the kinds of activities that the CST is involved in. I had never raised those kinds of questions before and didn't raise them in 2019. The CST complained that I had described it as Islamophobic, and I hadn't described it as Islamophobic at that stage. I had very deliberately kept that separate and made no comments about what the CST was doing in relation to Islam and Muslims, etc. And so what we were talking about then was there was very clear incidences of Islamophobia, as you've been talking about. But it's very clear that the CST is engaged in activities which blurs together the anti-Zionism of Muslim and left-wing people in this country, of anti-Zionist Jews, with anti-Semitism, and that in itself, arguably makes them engaged in activities which are biased against Muslims.
It's also worth clarifying that Zionism has actually always been a minority movement. At the time of the World Zionist Congress, the first one, initially it had been planned to take place in Germany, but the German Union of Rabbis opposed it very clearly. And that meant that because of this opposition from the German Union of Rabbis and others in the Jewish community, it had to take place in Basel, Switzerland instead. But moreover, the person credited with coining the phrase Zionism, Nathan Birnbaum, later became an anti-Zionist. We also know that out of 16 million Jewish people in the world, only around 6 million of them are Israeli citizens. So we can deduce from that that Zionism is quite clearly a minority movement. And so the next question I wanted to ask you, David, is in terms of the UJS, what was the next step?
Well, I mean, what happened was that through this period from April 2019 onwards, the UGS and others associated kept up this drumbeat of defamation of me, of descriptions of me as an anti-Semite, false descriptions of me as an anti-Semite. They then complained about the University of Bristol not properly engaging with their complaint. The president of the JSOC put into the public domain that she was the author of the complaint against me, as did the president of the UGS at the time. They both made it public that they'd complained about me, and so there was an ongoing campaign against me in the press. So I remember there was a piece in the Telegraph at the time, and then the CST made public comments which were defamatory of me, and I wrote long Twitter threads in response to that, as people can see online if they go and look it up. And then the next part of the process was that I made some public comments in February this year, where I said that the head of the JSOC at Bristol and the head of the UGS, the president of the UGS, had attacked and complained about me, which they had. I didn't say that their complaints were ridiculous or preposterous or effectively fake complaints, which they were. I just said that they had attacked and complained about me, and this apparently was something which I shouldn't have done. That I had somehow breached my duty of care to students, or I had offended people or something by simply reporting something which was factual, which was in the public domain, and which would be put into the public domain by the people I was actually talking about. So that led to a kind of open season where all sorts of Zionist organizations, including 5 you've never heard of, complained to the university about me. There was no formal complaint against me at all, in accordance with the university's own procedures. But nevertheless, the university announced an investigation of me in March, and that investigation has just concluded with me being sacked. I can't really talk too much about that investigation. Suffice to say that it's a travesty. And I wanted to make a special point of saying that the university statement given the end of last week says that they had commissioned a QC who had concluded that none of my comments broke the law, that my comments were lawful. And that's true. The report did say that. But the report also said, and this is important, and I wanted the university to make this plain, and they haven't. The report also said explicitly that my comments were not anti-Semitic. They did not engage or exceed the Equality Act of 2010. And that's been missing in much of the commentary that there has been. I have seen some headlines which said that I have been sacked for anti-Semitism, which is untrue, which is defamatory. And we've had some of those headlines changed already. Hopefully, if there's more, we'll have them changed too. But also, it's been said that I've been sacked after complaints about anti-Semitism had been made. Well, that in itself is misleading, because I was found not guilty of those complaints, and of course, that's something which the people who've been campaigning against me are unsurprisingly reluctant to admit. So that's been a really very serious assault on my reputation. As many people will know, I'm a lifelong anti-racist. There is not a shred of evidence in any comma, phrase, or sentence I've ever said that any of my comments have ever been anti-Semitic. I'm very well aware of the difference between the Jews as a people and Zionism as a political ideology. These things are different. Many Jews are not Zionists, as you say, and indeed, many Zionists are not Jews, as everyone points out with the Christian Zionists, etc., etc. So the idea that to criticize Zionism as a political ideology, or to criticize the actions or indeed the foundation of the state of Israel, is political commentary. It's not to do with hating Jews. It's got nothing at all to do with hating Jews. And that's something which people need to recognize, but which, of course, those who are pro-Israel in the Zionist movement don't want to recognize that, because they want to blur together Zionism and the Jews, and in fact say that Zionism is something fundamental to the Jews, and that's a political strategy, and we should recognize it as that.
Absolutely. I think it's also important that we make abundantly clear the relationship between the UJS and the state of Israel. Adam Shapira, who was a candidate for president of the UJS, asserted that the Israeli embassy funds the UJS. Also, we know that through the Massa Israel Journey program, of which the UJS directs its members towards, the space is open for members of the UJS to join the IDF through a program called Garin Tazabar. Now, this program is a kind of holistic, all-encompassing approach to enlisting foreign nationals into the IDF. It involves 5 seminars before being moved to a kibbutz, where they develop a network with those around them, and then they are integrated into the Israeli army. According to the IDF, this program, Garin Tazabur, which UJS members can join through the Massa Israel Journey program, has helped enlist over 1,500 teens from all around the world. And actually, it is a gateway not only for military service, but also for the claiming of Israeli citizenship, as the IDF had put forward that 70% of those that come into the IDF through this program stay on in the state of Israel after this military service is completed, which can go from 14 to 18 months. You also have another organization, which the Massa Journey program can plug people into, called Marva. Now, essentially, it's an 8-week-long program for which $2,000 are charged, where students are taught about life in the IDF. They are not only exposed to a quote-unquote mentally demanding program, they also use M16s with live ammunition in target practice. And you also see students taken to the Gadna base in the southern Naqab desert. Now, this is a place where Israeli school children are militarized by the Israeli state. And what happens is the Marva students that come through this program are integrated into the process. You have even seen Marva programs extend as far as the Israeli occupied Golan Heights in Syria. And this program has a proven track record serving as a gateway to young people from around the world, some of them not Israeli citizens or Jews, joining the IDF. You also have something in the UJS called the Israel Campus Fellow program, whereby members of the UJS can get, quote unquote, according to their own website, exclusive access to top speakers. They can get access to resources that help you facilitate Israel-related events. You can then go on to, quote unquote, be the leader for national and sometimes international Israel campaigns. And it also provides opportunities to bring your peers on campus to visit Israel. What you also have is seemingly a connection between those that have worked in official positions at the UJS, like Yair Zivan, who was campaign director at the UJS, went on to be press officer for the IDF, and was later on the international media coordinator for Shimon Peres as the president of Israel. You also have other figures that have used this same journey into positions not only in the IDF, but in the Israeli government. Constitutionally, the Union of Jewish Students is a Zionist organization. It states very clearly that one of its core values is encouraging engagement with Israel. And its aim is to inspire Jewish students to make an enduring commitment to the state of Israel. Its current chief executive, Aria Miller, was not only formerly the executive director of the Zionist organization, but also previously worked for the Israeli embassy in London. We also know that the UJS gives Jewish students awards for arranging visits to their campus by figures from the Israeli government. They promote the Birthright campaign, which is about encouraging Jewish people to become Israeli. They also work very closely with BICOM, which is a well-known Israel lobby group. What are the other ways in which the UJS is linked to the Israeli government, if that is something you can get into?
Well, I mean, as we saw in the lobby program, Al Jazeera's lobby program, we know, as you said, that they get funding from the embassy. They also get core funding from the United Jewish Israel Appeal, which is the biggest pro-Israel funding organization in the country, which is headed and has been headed for many years by Trevor Chin, who is, of course, known as a funder of Starmer's leadership campaign for the Labour Party, and subsequently became a Labour campaign advisor in the period after Starmer's election victory in the party. I mean, Trevor Chin is, if we might put it like this, is one of the most senior officers of the Zionist movement. Now, when I use a phrase like that, the Zionist movement, sometimes people say, well, you know, what does that mean? Is that something which is a kind of loose coalition of organizations? And I would say, well, there is a formal Zionist movement. And again, people, when I say formal, they say, well, you know, are the card-carrying members? And the answer to that is yes, there are card-carrying members of the Zionist movement. If you look on the Zionist Federation's website, you can see their membership cards. But I'm not really talking about card-carrying members. I'm talking more about the organizational structure of the Zionist movement. And there is a very, very clear organizational structure, which one can find by looking on their websites. You know, the investigative research technique of looking on the websites of organizations which are part of the movement. And the Zionist movement, as you said, started in the dying years of the 19th century. And it's an organization, a movement which has formal membership underneath the most important organization in the movement, which is the World Zionist Organization. And there's a clue in the name there. The World Zionist Organization is a global organization. And the World Zionist Organization in the Zionist Congresses, which came after the creation of the WZO, has several other key bodies which form the headquarters, if you like, the backbone of the transnational Zionist movement. That's the Jewish National Fund, Keren Hazod, and the Jewish Agency. Now, these are four organizations which are all based in the same building in Jerusalem called National Institutions House. And these four organizations are known as the national institutions, meaning Israeli national institutions. They have a curious status in Israel, which is that they're sort of non-government organizations, but also sort of governmental organizations. And that's used to the advantage of the Israeli government and the Zionist movement in various ways. But let's just stay with the formal Zionist movement. These four organizations constitute the head of the Zionist movement, and their supreme body which rules the Zionist movement and these organizations is the Zionist Congress, which meets every few years to take decisions which will affect all of the movement. That is, all the formal members of the movement. And the formal members of the movement underneath these four organizations are, on the one hand, the members of the World Zionist Organization, that is the Zionist federations in each country. And in this country, the Zionist Federation of the UK has something like 40 members, including some synagogues, but also a whole range of other pro-Israel groups. They're all formal members of the Zionist Federation, which is formally a member of the WZO and thus of the Zionist movement. And then the other organizations I mentioned earlier, Sir Trevor Chin's United Jewish Israel Appeal. It's the UK member of Keren Hazod, one of the four national institutions, and thus formally a member of the Zionist organization, of the Zionist movement. The JNF, the Jewish National Front, which, as you said, is engaged in expropriating land, Palestinian land, and giving it to Jews, can only give it to Jews. There's a UK version of that called the JNF UK. And then the Jewish Agency, which doesn't have an organizational base in this country, but has an office in this country. So all four of them have offices here, and they also have membership organizations. So the JNF is a member of the JNF in Israel, and the UJI is a member of Keren Hazod. And now, where does the UJS fit into this? Is it part of this structure? Yes, it is. The UJS, which oversees all JSOCs, Jewish societies, on campus, as far as we know, there are no JSOCs which are not part of the UJS, is a member and is guaranteed a seat on the executive of the World Union of Jewish Students. So the person who made the complaint about me, who was president of the UJS, was at the same time on the executive of the World Union of Jewish Students. So you can see that connection. The World Union of Jewish Students is, of course, itself a direct member of the World Zionist Organization, and as such, is allowed to elect delegates to Zionist Congress, the supreme decision-making body of the movement. So when I say the formal Zionist movement, that's what I'm talking about. It's a formal organization. You can list and delimit the precise members of that movement. Then, of course, there's an informal Zionist movement, which is beyond the formal Zionist movement. The CST, which we mentioned earlier, is not part of the formal Zionist movement. Indeed, it claims not even to be Zionist. But it is a pro-Israel organization. The Jewish Labour Movement is part of the Labour Party. Is it a formal part of the Zionist movement or not? Well, yes, it's a formal part of the Zionist movement, and thus is subject to the discipline and the rules of the formal Zionist movement, whereas something like the CST or Labour Friends of Israel or some other groups are not formal members of the group. So the Union of Jewish Students is a formal member of the Zionist movement, and that's simply a matter of fact. I mean, you can say that there are all sorts of things one can say about the formality of the central Zionist movement and the informality of the other groups and how they relate to each other and whether they coordinate and all those kind of questions. And of course, they do coordinate. The CST coordinated with the UJS to make complaints against me, even though one of them's formally in the Zionist movement and the other one's not. But so that's an empirical question. But how do these organizations relate to each other? So that's a long answer to your question. People don't understand that there is a structure here to the Zionist movement, and the structure implies agreed rules and agreed approaches. It doesn't mean that they don't ever disagree, but it does mean that they do agree on some things, on the rules and the structures, and that they also do collaborate with each other. And again, the question is, when do they collaborate, on what, and with what effect?
David, thank you so much for clarifying a lot of these important points. How can people get in contact with you and support you through the situation that you're going through now?
Well, there's a support campaign of a number of volunteers who've been helping me, which is contactable through supportmiller.org. I am reachable on email and the like. But the key thing I would say is that the university has taken this decision effectively at the behest of an influence campaign on behalf of a foreign power, a hostile foreign power. And they have obviously taken this decision because they can't withstand the pressure which has been exerted on them by that influence campaign. And so, the only real way of dealing with this is to show that people will not tolerate that kind of activities, to show that it's possible and continues to be possible for people to talk and discuss and research and lecture about Islamophobia. The fact that I've been sacked for raising the issue of Islamophobia in general and on campus is an extraordinary indictment of the level of debate about Islamophobia in this country, and indeed at the University of Bristol. So I would say that what people can do is they know what they could do. They can write letters, they can engage in debate and discussion about this. But it's really important to understand this is not just the effects of cancel culture or the war on free speech. This is directly about a campaign by a hostile foreign state, by the State of Israel, through its many assets or pawns, to use the terminology which I was so criticized for, to destabilize the possibility of serious protest or raising the issue of the rights of the Palestinians. In May this year, we saw the ongoing ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah and in Silwan, and we saw the response of the Israeli state and indeed of the settlers to that. That's what they don't want us to know about. That's what they don't want us to talk about. And the more that they continue to campaign against people like me, the more that they will have to face a resistance from those who believe in Palestinian liberation. So I would say, everybody knows what they have to do, I think, and let's go on and do that.
So there you have it, people. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Watchdog. Get involved in the campaign. Let's do this. Solidarity with David Miller.
Thank you.